In the 4 years since the conflict in Syria began, Lebanon has opened up its doors to almost 1 million Syrian refugees. And joining us now to detail the quality of life these refugees are facing and how they're being received by their neighbor, here's Ninette Kelley. She is the representative of the United Nations High Commission on Refugees in Lebanon. And should we start by saying welcome home?
Thank you very much.
You're
it's nice to be here.
From Toronto.
I am.
But you don't live here.
I don't live here. I live in Beirut.
You live in Beirut, which used to be called the Paris of the Middle East.
Of the Middle East, yes.
And
yes.
hasn't been for quite a long time.
Not a long time, unfortunately.
Let's just show a map and we'll get this started here. Everybody, I think, knows what we're talking about in the Middle East, but just in case, we're talking about a country, Lebanon, that was established in 1920, population of about 4.4 million, roughly the 80th largest economy in the world. There it is, west of Syria, just north of Israel, the Paris of the Middle East, as we used to call Beirut. That was, of course, before a decades-long civil war. And now Luca Renda, the country director for the UN Development Program, says Lebanon has the largest per capita recipient of refugees in the world. And here are the numbers which you know all too well. As the conflict in Syria enters its 4th year, there are nearly 2.5 million Syrians registered as refugees in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. The agency has registered almost 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. If the current influx of Syrian refugees into Lebanon, that's 12,000 every week, continues, there could be more than 1.6 million registered refugees in the country by the end of this year. And I presume that doesn't refer to those who are not registered, because I guess there are lots that come that don't get registered. Fair to say?
I think there's some that don't get registered, although it's a small country and we have our reach right throughout the entire country. But it's true, there are those that aren't registered, and it doesn't include those refugees who are in the country who aren't Syrians.
Mm-hmm. How do the families that manage to escape from Syria manage to escape from Syria?
With great difficulty. 80% of those who arrive have already been displaced within Syria. So their trajectory to Lebanon is a long and arduous one. Oftentimes they leave their neighborhoods, they go to another village, and that village becomes under siege and they move to another until they have no choice but to leave and come to Lebanon. Lebanon's usually the last choice, and it's when all has been exhausted.
On foot?
On foot, some are in cars and taxis and buses, and many come with very few belongings. Most come with almost nothing.
How do they get across the border?
They're admitted across the border. They arrive often in vehicles, sometimes on foot, and they're processed by the Lebanese security, and they're allowed in, and then they're registered by us.
I can't imagine that a country of 4.5 million people could have anticipated or would have had the infrastructure in place to handle 1 million refugees.
They didn't at all. And in fact,
at
8,000, they were telling us this is more than we can handle, because at the time they had 280,000 Palestinian refugees as well, still do. But they did, and they continue to accept them. And that's why I say Lebanon is often portrayed in the world as a country that has full of problems, and that's true, but it's also a country that has shown extraordinary generosity of a kind I've never witnessed before.
When the people do come, where do they settle?
Initially, a lot of them lived with families, Lebanese families, some of whom they didn't know, but now the numbers are so great. We have around 60% who rent accommodation. Many of them are 1 or 2 families living in a single bedroom apartment, very modest. We have 30% who live in very precarious circumstances, in tents, in unfinished buildings, garages, animal stalls, that kind of thing.
Who would not, I guess, have the what you would call the comforts of life?
Absolutely not.
No, I mean, running water, flush toilets, any of that kind of stuff?
None of that.
None of that. Are there so-called refugee camps, the likes of which we think of in other parts of the world?
Not formal ones, because the government didn't want to have any formal camps, none like Jordan. They are rather scarred by the Palestinian experience. So initially, refugees just lived in these buildings or in apartments or with Lebanese families. But then they started to set up their own camps, and these are informal tented settlements, and they lack all the amenities that one would like to see and one would see if you had a more formal environment.
How many people, for example, living in one particular area like that?
We would have, right now we have close to 500 informal tented settlements, and that would represent close to 100,000 persons.
What are you guys doing about all this?
Well, we do a lot. We receive people, we register, we ascertain their needs. We work with 60 partners, including other UN organizations. So the World Food Program, for example, provides food assistance. We provide shelter and health care and education assistance to refugees, but we don't have enough resources to meet all needs. So what we're providing is really the very basic necessities of life. And what is really the greatest shame is that we're unable to make sure that everybody can live a dignified existence. And so what you see in Lebanon is really very, very sad.
Kids go to school?
Great question. We have now 400,000 Syrian children. Last year in Lebanon, 300,000 Lebanese children were registered in schools. So now we have the Syrian refugee children who need public education eclipse the Lebanese, and there just simply isn't room. So we're only able to accommodate 100,000 children in the formal school system, and that leaves us trying to cater to 300,000 children, their education needs in an informal kind of arrangement. It's not at all ideal.
So if you're a young person who's just graduated from Teachers College and you're looking for adventure, would you say just come on by and help us out? We can use your help?
Not so easy unless you speak Arabic, and also unless you get certified by the Lebanese ministry. And what we're trying to do is improve the conditions so that the Lebanese Ministry of Education gets a lot more resources to build more schools and portables and more accommodations so we can fit more children into the formal system.
Do you know if it's the hope of these people to return to Syria someday?
Absolutely.
It is, eh?
You don't talk to they love their country. And living in Lebanon is no dream. They're grateful for the safety that they've received, but this is not an ideal situation for them, and the pictures reveal that. So no, everyone you talk to, they dream to go back to Syria. In fact, I was in a camp just the other day where these little children talked about how they longed to go back to Syria. They sang a song, the end of which was, they said, remember, we're human too.
See, when we think of Syria, we've been accustomed to thinking of Syria as, hell on earth for the last 4 years, and it's hard to imagine anybody wants to actually go back there. But they do, eh?
Of course, and anybody who knew Syria before the conflict would know that it was an amazing country and beautiful, and children were in school and a good education system and solid healthcare system.
Run by a second-generation despot, though.
And people want to go back. People had lives, they had homes, they had jobs, just like your neighbors do.
Yeah, but my neighbors live in a nice democratic country. And these people didn't, and they still want to go back anyway. I'm just interested in that.
No, it's a good question. A lot of people, they didn't have the democratic freedoms that we experience here, but they had a quality of life that sustained them and provided a future for themselves and their children. So if those who are familiar with Syria would come back and talk about Syria, the country, the people, in glowing terms, notwithstanding the difficult political environment that existed there.
I'm trying to imagine a situation, though, where, you've got the equivalent of a quarter of the population basically saying, here we are, help us. My math isn't great, but it's almost as if more than 8 million people just showed up to Canada and said, take us in.
Oh, much more than that. You're right.
It's like that.
And absolutely.
Can you...
It's like 500,000 people arriving in PEI. Because Lebanon's just twice the size of Prince Edward Island.
How well are the Lebanese getting along with their new visitors?
They have been extraordinary. Nothing short of that. Their generosity has seen no limit. But it is fair to say, and one has to say it, they feel the pinch, and tensions are rising because Lebanon has suffered a lot from the Syria crisis. They've taken a big economic hit and loss of trade and investment, tourism, consumer confidence. Their economy is really running to the ground, and they are now trying to subsidize the arrival of all these new people with not enough support from the international community to help them do so.
Here's how you put it in the New York Times last year, in fact. You said, they are putting enormous pressure on water, sanitation, education, and healthcare systems. Wages are plummeting. Lebanese workers complain they can no longer find jobs, which Syrians will do for much less. Poor Lebanese envy the international food, shelter, and medical aid given to the refugees. Shopkeepers resent the competition brought by new Syrian-run establishments that they say are undercutting prices. The anger could boil over. Already there have been curfews imposed and sporadic attacks against refugees. This seems worrisome. This looks like it's leading to a crescendo that is not going to be pleasant.
It may not be, and that's why we continue to say to the world, please come to the assistance of Lebanon. Help this small country cope, because it simply cannot do it on its own. We've done a lot of interesting projects in the last 6 months to help local communities manage the increase of refugees in their areas through improvements to schools, water and sanitation improvements, power generators, bringing services that these communities didn't have before, because refugees are living in some of the most impoverished Lebanese communities as well. This is helping to mitigate the tensions, but clearly a lot more is needed.
So what do the people who've got the money, like the IMF and the World Bank and Western countries, Arab countries, what are they doing to help out?
There's been quite a bit of support for the humanitarian appeal, and that has been a lot, but not sufficient, is what I would say. So last year we were only 53% funded. This year we're just over 14% funded for the entire year. So we really need to continue interest to keep up the support for the humanitarian program that we have in place, and by that I'm talking about for all agencies. But we're also saying, please governments, use your development funding as well. Use your stabilization funding to help shore up Lebanon so that Lebanon doesn't collapse and the conflict that we see now in Syria does not play out in much more dramatic terms in Lebanon.
You know, if they change the name of the country to Ukraine, it might be a different story.
That's always the risk, that another story takes the headlines, and that's for those of us that are working on the ground, we always have a little sigh.
I didn't mean to be a smartass in saying that, but the reality is they've captured the whole world's attention right now.
The Ukraine has captured the world's attention, and meanwhile, a very dramatic situation is unfolding in the Middle East that could have very grave repercussions for many years to come.
What does that mean?
It means that if the Syria conflict continues as it looks like it's going to, and should Lebanon not get more support in order for it to manage this crisis, that the conflict that you see, a lot of the same groups that are warring in Syria are also present in Lebanon. And that could just become a tinderbox. And I'm not saying that development assistance or humanitarian assistance alone will help to mitigate that risk, but it certainly will do a lot to stem the growing tensions that we're seeing playing out today.
I'm going to really oversimplify this for the purposes of asking a question here, but essentially it looks like there are two options. You've got President Obama's option, which is, some minimal support to the opposition forces against Assad in Syria. And you've got John McCain, his former competitor for the presidency, saying we need a much more robust military response, because if we ever want to get those Syrian refugees in Lebanon back to their home country, you got to get rid of Assad and put a different government in place. What's the right approach?
Well, our approach is a humanitarian agency.
I
have to say this. I mean, I think that what what our agencies have called for a long time is massive diplomacy on a quieter scale, and that there has to be a lot done with the powers in the region to bring them to see the futility of the current state of affairs and how desperate the situation will continue is now and will continue to unravel for the future, that will put not just the security interests of Lebanon or Syria at risk, but those of the surrounding regions and further afield.
So the United Nations genuinely sees a potential diplomatic settlement to the problems that Assad is having with his opponents?
I'm saying that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, this is what he calls for. He calls for a diplomatic solution to the problem, because the current situation is not going to fix itself on its own.
Here's what a reporter for The Guardian was writing last fall. Tracy McVeigh, reporting that Lebanon remains in relative peace, but the influx of Syrians is putting a strain on its resources. Tensions are rising. The little nation has not finished rebuilding after its own civil war, and its factions are many. The country remains vulnerable to the demographic changes that the influx of mainly Sunni Muslim Syrians is bringing. A permanent demographic shift could imperil fragile religious balances that are currently in political limbo. Okay, you live in Beirut, so
right.
How politically stable or not does it look right now?
Oh, it's not politically stable. It's a country that has always had, and we've had for the last year, we've had difficulty even forming a government, but now there's a government formed, and they have an agenda that they're willing to pursue together, which involves all the different factions. Whether or not they'll succeed or not we'll have to wait and see. I don't agree that the Syrian refugees will create an indelible population change in the country forever because the Syrian refugees will one day go home. It's unlike the Palestinian situation where the Syrian refugees actually have a home to go home to. So once peace and security is restored in Syria, those refugees that are in Lebanon will return. What's far more risky at the present time is the engagement of different groups within Lebanon in the conflict inside Syria. And though retaliation for that involvement is now being played out in the streets of Beirut and Tripoli and Saida and in the areas on the coast, on the border of Syria. So that's what is really placing the country at great risk at the present time. But the presence of refugees is not helping matters either.
Do we know whether Assad is happy to see these people leave?
I really can't speak for Assad, and I haven't heard a statement from him on the exodus of refugees into Lebanon. But the situation is what it is, and the refugees will tell you that they don't feel safe enough to return home.
Because I appreciate the fact that you say that when Syria is resolved, these people will come home. It won't be a permanent problem like the Palestinian refugee situation. But all the experts who knew all about this said the Assad situation was going to resolve itself in a year, and here we are 3-4 years later, and it doesn't look like it's coming to an end anytime soon. In the meantime, you've got this population of many, many thousands of young, uneducated, angry males who are Syrian living in Lebanon, and that just has got time bomb written all over it, don't you think?
It's a worry, especially for the youth, which is why we're trying to target them especially with vocational training and education training, so there is some kind of alternative to the scenario that you're describing. But yes, of course it's a concern.
Can I just ask you finally, how did you get into this line of work?
Oh, a long time ago. I've always been interested in immigration. I was a lawyer here in Canada for many years. I served on the Immigration Refugee Board, wrote a book on the history of Canadian immigration with Michael Truelko. So this line has always been an interest of mine.
It's one thing to do that. It's another thing to move to Beirut for, how many years have you been there now?
Well, I've been there for 4 years.
4 years?
Yes, but I joined UNHCR in 2002, and that's what we do. We go to places where we're needed. It's a great privilege.
Well, we thank you very much for coming into TVO tonight and sharing your views on it.
Thank you so much for having me and for your interest.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.